I woke up on my 68th birthday to an empty house and a text message from my son that said, "Happy B-Day, Dad. Swamped at work. Talk this WKND." I made my own coffee, sat on my own porch, and watched the light come up over the pecan trees I'd planted the year my wife Carol and I bought this land outside Waco. 3 weeks later, at a family cookout I hosted for my granddaughter's birthday, my son-in-law grabbed my wrist and pressed my palm flat against the side of my own smoker until the skin blistered, in front of 22 guests, because I told him no, I would not be signing my ranch over to him. My daughter looked at my hand, looked at me, and said, "Dad, you're so stubborn it's embarrassing. You're doing this to yourself." They laughed it off as an accident. They had no idea I'd already made a phone call 3 weeks before that would end with both of them standing in a courtroom. I'm glad you're here with me. Before we get into it, tell me where you're joining from tonight. I like picturing all of you out there. Welcome back to the porch. Quick note before we start. This is a fictional story, the kind of thing that could happen, told the way I'd tell it if it happened to me. Now, let me tell you how it went. The morning of my 68th birthday, I sat by myself, the way I'd been sitting by myself most mornings since Carol passed 2 years prior. Ovarian cancer took her in 14 months, start to finish, and after the funeral, I kept living in the same white farmhouse on the same 140 acres we'd bought back in 1987 with a loan. I was terrified we wouldn't be able to pay off. We paid it off in 9 years. I still remember signing that last check at the kitchen table and Carol crying into a dish towel because she couldn't believe the land was finally, fully ours. People around McGregor knew me as Gerald Hutchins, the fella who ran cattle and grew winter wheat and drove a 20-year-old Chevy with a dented tailgate. What most of them didn't know, because I never saw a reason to tell them, was that back in the 90s I'd invested some cattle money into a little startup that made irrigation sensors, and that company got bought out by a much bigger agricultural tech firm in 2011. The buyout wasn't the kind of money that changes how a man dresses or what truck he drives. Not for me anyway, but it was the kind of money that meant I never had to worry about anything again for the rest of my life, and neither would my children, if I chose to leave it to them the right way. I had 2 kids. My son Marcus lived up in Dallas, working in commercial real estate, married with 2 boys of his own, and I saw him maybe 4 times a year, mostly around holidays, mostly for an hour or 2 before he had somewhere else to be. My daughter Renee lived 20 minutes from me in Waco proper with her husband Tyler and my granddaughter Josie, who'd just turned 9. Renee I saw more often, which I'd been grateful for, right up until the year everything started feeling different. Tyler had come into our family 11 years ago as a soft-spoken young man who sold insurance and seemed a little unsure of himself around Carol and me, which I liked. I've never trusted a man who walks into another man's house acting like he already owns the place. But somewhere in the last 3 years, since around the time Carol got sick, actually, Tyler had changed. He'd started his own insurance agency, which on paper looked like ambition, and I was proud of him for it at first. Then, I started hearing things. A neighbor down the road, Dale Whitfield, mentioned at the feed store that he'd heard Tyler's agency was overextended, that Tyler had taken out a business loan against something, and it hadn't gone the way he planned. I didn't ask questions. It wasn't my business, or so I told myself. Then Carol died, and Renee started coming around more, which felt like a blessing at the time. She'd bring Josie over on Sundays, we'd sit on the porch, and for a while it felt like the 2 of us were healing together. But Tyler started coming too, and he'd wander the property in a way that unsettled me, even though I couldn't have told you exactly why. He'd walk the fence line, asking about acreage. He'd ask what the land might be worth just out of curiosity. He'd mention, more than once, how much upkeep a place this size must be for a man my age. Alone. "You ever think about downsizing, Gerald?" he asked me once, standing in my kitchen with his hands in his pockets, looking out the window at the barn like he was pricing it. "A place this big, all this land, it's a lot for one person." "I've got cattle to run," I told him. "Keeps me busy. Keeps me sane." "Sure. Sure," he said and smiled the way he always smiled. Easy and warm, the kind of smile that had probably sold a lot of insurance policies. "Just thinking about you, that's all." I should have paid closer attention to how often he was just thinking about me. About 4 months before my birthday, I noticed Renee had started asking careful questions too, questions that felt rehearsed, even when she tried to make them sound casual. Had I thought about my will? Had I talked to a lawyer recently? Did I know what would happen to the ranch if something happened to me suddenly? I told her, honestly, that everything was handled, that Carol and I had set things up years ago with our attorney, a man named Harold Vance, who'd done our estate work since before Renee was born. That answer never seemed to satisfy her. She'd nod and change the subject, but I could see something working behind her eyes, and it wasn't peace of mind. 2 weeks before the cookout, Tyler came by on a Tuesday evening, alone. No Renee, no Josie, which was unusual enough that I noticed it immediately. He said he wanted to talk business, man to man. We sat at the kitchen table, and he laid out what he called an opportunity. His agency, he explained, was expanding, and expanding required capital, and he'd been looking at some numbers. And wouldn't it make sense for the family if I considered transferring the ranch, or at least a significant portion of the equity in it, into a trust that he and Renee would manage? He framed it as protecting the land from estate taxes, protecting Josie's inheritance, protecting me from the burden of maintaining 140 acres by myself as I got older. "It's not about taking anything from you, Gerald," he said, leaning forward with his hands folded like he'd rehearsed the posture. "It's about making sure everything's structured the right way before something happens where you're not able to make these decisions anymore." I looked at him for a long moment. "Tyler," I said, "I appreciate you thinking about it, but I've got a lawyer for structuring. I don't need my son-in-law doing my estate planning at my kitchen table on a Tuesday night." Something flickered across his face, quick and gone. "Of course," he said, smiling again. "Just trying to help." He left 20 minutes later, and I sat at that table for a long while after he did, turning something over in my mind. I picked up the phone, and I called Harold Vance the next morning. Harold had been my lawyer for 31 years. He was 74 now, silver-haired, sharp as a tack, and he'd known Carol and me since back when our biggest legal concern was drafting a simple will and making sure the ranch would pass cleanly to our kids. I told him what Tyler had said. I told him about the questions Renee had been asking. I told him about the fence walking, the appraisal comments, the sudden concern for my well-being that had started right around the time Dale Whitfield mentioned Tyler's business troubles at the feed store. Harold was quiet for a moment on the other end of the line. "Gerald," he said, "I want you to do something for me, and I want you to trust me on it, even if it feels wrong. I want you to act completely normal. Don't confront them. Don't change anything visible. Let me look into a few things first." "What things?" "Tyler's business," Harold said. "And I want to pull the actual documents on your trust. Make sure nothing's been touched. Sometimes when people start asking a lot of careful questions about an estate, it's because they've already started trying to move pieces around without permission. I want to make sure that hasn't happened here." That sentence sat in my stomach like a stone for 3 days. It took Harold a week and a half to come back to me with what he'd found, and by then, the cookout invitation had already gone out. I'd planned it originally for Josie's birthday, a simple backyard gathering, but once Harold told me what he needed time to investigate, I decided to go ahead with it anyway. "Normal," I kept telling myself. "Act normal. Let them come. Let them show me who they really are in front of witnesses, the same way they'd apparently been showing everyone else a version of me that wasn't true." Because that's what Harold found first, before anything else. Tyler had been talking, not just to Renee, but to half of McGregor and Waco both. He'd told people at church, people at his agency, 2 of Renee's oldest friends, that I'd been having moments lately, forgetting conversations, getting confused about dates, wandering the property at odd hours. None of it was true. I hadn't forgotten a single conversation in my life that mattered to me, and Lord knows I could still run cattle numbers in my head faster than most men could punch them into a calculator. But Tyler had spent weeks quietly constructing a story, the story of a declining old man who needed to be protected from himself. And by the time the cookout rolled around, 22 people were going to walk through my gate already believing it. I didn't know the full shape of what I was walking into that Saturday. I only knew the sky was clear, the pecan trees along the fence had started dropping the first husks of the season, and I had a fresh bag of mesquite chips soaking for the smoker, the way Carol always insisted, because she said mesquite was the only wood with any honesty in it. Renee and Tyler arrived early to help set up, Josie trailing behind them with a paper crown on her head that said, "Birthday Girl," in glitter letters. Renee hugged me and seemed, For a moment, like the daughter I remembered from before, all the careful questions started. Tyler shook my hand, clapped me on the shoulder, and immediately began moving the folding chairs I'd set up under the oak tree into a wider semicircle, angled toward the smoker and the back porch. "Gonna get a good crowd today, Gerald," he said, surveying the yard like a man inspecting a property he intended to buy. "You know, with a spread like this, you really could do something special out here. Event space, maybe. People pay good money for a barn wedding these days." "I raise cattle," I said. "That's the something special." He laughed, like I'd made a joke, and kept walking the fence line. Guests started arriving around 4. I stood at the smoker with my tongs, greeting people as they came through the gate, and I noticed, the way I hadn't let myself notice before, how carefully some of them looked at me. A woman from Renee's church, Sandra Kellerman, took both my hands in hers when she said hello, the way people do at funerals. "Gerald, honey, you're looking well," she said, with a warmth that had pity folded into it. "Renee's told us you've had some hard days lately. I've been praying for you." "I don't know what she told you," I said, keeping my voice level, "but I feel fine, Sandra." "Of course you do, sweetheart," she said, patting my arm, and moved on before I could say anything else. By the time the sun started dropping behind the barn and I had the brisket resting and the sausage going, I understood exactly what kind of afternoon this was. It wasn't a birthday party. It was an audition. And the role everyone had been cast to play was witness. Josie blew out her candles a little after 6. Everyone clapped, everyone sang, and for about 4 minutes it felt like an ordinary family gathering, the kind Carol and I used to host every summer of our married life. Then Tyler asked me, in front of the whole yard, whether I'd had the ranch appraised recently. "Why would I need an appraisal?" I said. "I'm not selling anything. Just thinking ahead," Tyler said, smiling that same easy smile, glancing at the small crowd around us like he was performing for them. "Making sure everything's protected. You know, at your age, it's smart to have things in order." "Things are in order, Tyler." "Are they, though?" Renee said, and something in her voice had an edge I hadn't heard from her before. "Not toward me, not ever." "Because, Dad, you won't even talk to us about the will. You won't let anyone help you with anything. It's like you'd rather this whole place fall apart around you than admit you might need us." I felt my face go hot, not from embarrassment, but from something closer to grief, watching my daughter say those words in front of 20 people who already believed I was slipping. "I don't need anyone to take over my ranch to prove I love my family," I said quietly. "Nobody's talking about taking over," Tyler said, stepping closer, his voice pitched to Carrie, performing concern for the crowd behind him. "Day. We're talking about protecting you, Gerald. Whether you can see that or not." And that's when I made a mistake. The only real mistake I made that whole evening. I turned to walk back to the smoker, meaning to end the conversation, and Tyler grabbed my wrist, not hard enough to look violent to the people watching, but hard enough that I couldn't pull away, and in what looked to everyone like an accidental stumble, he pressed the side of my hand flat against the metal grate of the smoker for exactly as long as it took me to yell and wrench free. The pain went up my arm like a current. I stumbled back, cradling my hand against my chest, and the whole yard went quiet. "Oh my gosh, are you okay?" Tyler said instantly, already performing the aftermath, already reaching toward me like a concerned son-in-law. I slipped. "I'm so sorry. I didn't mean to push you into it." He hadn't slipped. I'd felt his grip. I'd felt the deliberate half-second of pressure before he let go. Renee looked at my blistering hand, and for one terrible instant, I thought I saw something honest cross her face. Fear, maybe, or recognition. But then it closed over, and what came out of her mouth instead was, "Dad, why do you always have to make everything a scene? You could have just stepped back. You're doing this to yourself, being so stubborn about everything." 22 people stood in my backyard and watched my daughter tell me that a burn on my hand was my own fault for refusing to sign over my land. Nobody said a word in my defense. Sandra Kellerman looked away. Dale Whitfield studied his boots. A couple of Renee's friends exchanged a glance that told me they'd already decided, before they ever walked through my gate, which version of this family they believed. I didn't argue. I didn't raise my voice. I said I needed to run my hand under cold water, and I walked into my own house while my own birthday guests for my own granddaughter stood in my own backyard and let it happen. I stood at the kitchen sink for a long time, with cold water running over my hand, listening to the muffled sound of the party continuing outside, laughter drifting through the window like nothing at all had happened. And somewhere in that long, quiet, burning stretch of time, something in me went very still and very clear, the way it does right before a decision you've been circling for weeks finally lands. I dried my hand, wrapped it in a clean dish towel, and walked back outside like nothing was wrong. I smiled. I served the rest of the brisket. I let Tyler refill my lemonade and clap me on the back and tell Dale Whitfield a story about a fishing trip like he hadn't just burned my hand on my own smoker 20 minutes before. I let Renee kiss my cheek goodbye at the end of the night and say, "Love you, Dad. Get some rest," like she hadn't just told an entire yard full of people that I'd hurt myself. I was acting normal. Exactly the way Harold had told me to. At 11 o'clock that night, once the last car had pulled out of the driveway, I sat down at my kitchen table with my burned hand throbbing under the dish towel, and I called Harold Vance. He answered on the second ring. "He put my hand on the smoker tonight," I said, "in front of 22 people. My own daughter told me it was my fault." There was a long breath on the other end of the line. "Are you hurt bad?" "I've had worse from the cattle," I said, which wasn't entirely true, but it was true enough for that moment. "Harold, I need you to tell me what you found. All of it. Tonight." "Gerald, tonight," I said, and something in my voice must have told him I meant it, because he didn't argue. "I'll be at your place at 7 tomorrow morning," he said. "I make coffee at 6:45. 7, he said, and for the first time that call, I heard something almost like a smile in his voice. "You're going to want to be sitting down for this." Harold arrived at exactly 7 the next morning, carrying the same worn leather satchel he'd carried into my kitchen for 3 decades of closings and filings and, now, apparently, an investigation into my own family. He declined coffee, which told me more than any words could have. He laid 3 things on my table. The first was a formal letter from a forensic accountant Harold had quietly hired 2 weeks earlier, the moment I'd first called him about Tyler's Tuesday night proposal. It detailed Tyler's insurance agency finances in careful, damning language. The agency wasn't expanding. It was collapsing. Tyler had taken out 2 business loans in the last 18 months, both secured against personal assets, both now in default territory. He owed back payroll taxes. A former business partner had filed a civil suit against him for misappropriating client premium funds, nearly $90,000, that should have gone to insurers and instead had vanished into Tyler's operating account. And, from there, into a downtown condo that Renee, according to Harold's investigator, did not know existed. "He's underwater, Gerald," Harold said. "Badly. And the only asset in his reach large enough to bail him out is your ranch." The second document was worse. It was a copy of a durable power of attorney form, my name typed at the top, my signature forged at the bottom, in a hand that was close enough to fool a bank teller in a hurry, but not close enough to fool a man who'd signed his own name on cattle contracts for 50 years. Harold's investigator had found it because Tyler, 3 weeks earlier, had walked into a branch of my bank in Waco and attempted to use it to inquire about the ranch's mortgage status and available equity. The bank had flagged the visit as unusual, and, because Harold had already quietly placed a fraud alert on my accounts the day after our first phone call, the inquiry had triggered a notification straight to Harold's office, instead of proceeding any further. I sat and looked at my own forged signature for a long time. My hand, still wrapped and aching, rested on the table beside it. "He tried to do this without me even knowing," I said. "He tried," Harold said. "It didn't work. But Gerald, I need to tell you something else, and I need you to hear all of it before you say anything." The third item was a single sheet of paper with 8 steps written on it in Harold's small, precise handwriting. "I don't think Tyler is doing this alone," Harold said quietly. "I think Renee knows more than she's letting on. I'm not saying she orchestrated it. I think she's scared and confused, and maybe she's telling herself a story about protecting you that lets her look away from what her husband's actually doing. But the phone records I was able to obtain show her and Tyler on calls together late at night for the last 4 months, far more frequently than is normal for a married couple living under the same roof. Something is being planned between them. I don't yet know how much she understands about the forgery specifically. I intend to find out before we do anything else. I didn't say anything for a long moment. Outside the kitchen window, the pecan trees stood still in the early light, the same trees Carol had watched from this same window for 31 years. "What do we do?" I finally said. "We let it keep happening," Harold said. Carefully. "On camera, if we can manage it, and on paper, always. We do not confront Tyler. We do not confront Renee. You are going to keep being exactly who you've always been, an old rancher who loves his family and trusts too easily, and you are going to let Tyler Whitmore walk himself, one document at a time, directly into a federal fraud charge. And Renee?" Harold's face softened, just slightly. "That," he said, "is the part I can't build a plan around yet. That part depends on her. The next 6 weeks were the strangest of my life. I went about my days exactly as I always had, feeding cattle, mending fence, sitting on my porch in the evenings, while Harold's investigator quietly built a case file thick enough to require its own briefcase. I let Tyler come by twice more, each time steering the conversation gently toward his trust proposal, each time recording our conversation on a small device Harold had given me, tucked into my shirt pocket, technically legal under Texas's one-party consent law, a fact Harold reminded me of 3 separate times, like he was worried I'd feel guilty about it. I wasn't guilty. I was patient. There's a particular kind of patience you learn running a ranch for 40 years. You don't force a calving, you don't force a drought to end. You wait, and you watch, and you let things happen on their own timeline while you stay ready. The second recorded conversation was the one that mattered most. Tyler came by on a Thursday evening in October, and this time, he was less careful with his words, more desperate. The numbers on his failing agency clearly weighing on him harder by the week. He told me, plainly, that if I didn't sign the trust documents transferring majority control of the ranch to him and Renee within the next 30 days, he couldn't guarantee what would happen to his marriage to my daughter, because the pressure of his business debts was, in his words, eating them alive. It wasn't quite a threat. It wasn't quite not one either. And underneath it, for the first time, he let slip a detail Harold had been waiting weeks to hear. "Renee already knows the trust paperwork's basically done, Gerald," he said. "She just wants you to sign it clean, without a fight, so it doesn't get ugly with the lawyers." I felt something cold settle in my chest, not because it confirmed Renee knew about a trust I'd suspected that for weeks, but because clean, without a fight, told me she knew there was a version of this that could get ugly, which meant she understood, on some level, that what was happening wasn't fully honest. I called Harold that same night. "She knows something," I said. "I don't know how much. But she knows more than a woman who's innocent in this." "I know," Harold said. "I got a call an hour ago, too, from a different direction." "What direction?" "Your granddaughter's teacher," Harold said, and I felt my stomach drop before he even finished the sentence. "Josie's been drawing pictures at school. Family pictures. Her teacher flagged one to the school counselor, because in it, your house is labeled Daddy's new house, and she'd drawn you standing outside the fence, not inside it. The counselor mentioned it to Renee at a parent conference last week, apparently as a gentle, this is probably nothing observation. Renee did not react gently. She left the meeting early and didn't return calls for 2 days. I sat with that for a long time after Harold and I hung up. A 9-year-old girl, coloring in crayon what she'd absorbed from the adults around her, without anyone ever explaining it to her directly. Somewhere in my house, Tyler had already started talking about my land like it was theirs, clearly enough, often enough, that it had made its way into his daughter's drawings before it had ever made its way to my kitchen table, honestly. That was the night I stopped being patient in the way I'd been patient before. That was the night I decided the plan needed an ending, not just evidence. I asked Harold to set the ending in motion 2 weeks later, on a Tuesday, the same day Tyler had originally set as his self-imposed 30-day deadline for my signature. I invited Renee and Tyler to the ranch, telling them I'd decided to sign the trust documents after all, that they'd worn me down, that I wanted my family's help managing things as I got older. I could hear the relief in Tyler's voice on the phone, could practically hear him already spending money he didn't yet have. They arrived at 4 in the afternoon. Harold was already there, seated at my kitchen table with a folder in front of him, along with a man I introduced simply as a colleague of Harold's, who was, in fact, a financial crimes investigator from the district attorney's office in McLennan County, there in an unofficial, observing capacity, at Harold's careful request. Tyler laid the trust documents on the table with the eagerness of a man closing the biggest deal of his life. Renee sat beside him, quiet, her hands folded in her lap, not quite meeting my eyes. Before I sign anything, I said, I want to ask both of you something, and I want an honest answer. Tyler's smile flickered, just slightly. Of course, Gerald. Renee, I said, and I watched her flinch at the directness of it. Did you know Tyler forged my signature on a power of attorney form 3 weeks ago and tried to use it at my bank? The color left her face so fast I thought for a second she might faint. What? She said, and her eyes went to Tyler, and whatever she saw on his face in that instant told her everything she needed to know, because Tyler did not deny it. Tyler's mouth opened and closed twice, and nothing came out. I didn't. Renee started, and stopped, and started again. Tyler, what is he talking about? Gerald, I can explain, Tyler said. But Harold slid the forged document across the table, along with the bank's fraud alert notification, and the room went very quiet. I have a full financial forensic report on your agency, Harold said calmly. Documentation of 2 loan defaults, a civil suit for misappropriated client funds, an undisclosed second property, and now a forged power of attorney, with your signature on the transmission log at the bank. I also have 4 separate audio recordings of you pressuring Gerald to sign over ranch equity under circumstances that a court is going to have no trouble describing as coercion of an elderly family member. This gentleman, Harold said, nodding toward the quiet investigator at the end of the table, is going to need to speak with you both separately, starting tonight. Tyler stood up so fast his chair scraped backward across the floor. This is insane, he said. Gerald, you set me up. You set yourself up, I said, and my voice didn't shake, which surprised me, because my heart was pounding hard enough that I could feel it in my burned hand. You burned my hand on my own smoker in front of my granddaughter's birthday party, Tyler, and then you tried to steal the land my wife and I spent 40 years building. I didn't set anything up. I just stopped pretending I didn't see it. Renee was crying now, silently, her hands pressed over her mouth. Dad, she said, I swear I didn't know about the forgery. I didn't know I thought we were just going to ask you. I thought, you knew there was a version of this that would get ugly, I said quietly. Tyler told me that himself, 3 weeks ago. You knew enough to be afraid of the truth coming out clean. That's not nothing, Renee. She didn't have an answer for that. She just kept crying, and Tyler kept insisting this was all some kind of misunderstanding right up until the investigator asked him, calmly, whether he'd like to step outside and discuss the bank's fraud alert timeline, and Tyler's face went the color of old ash. The weeks that followed weren't dramatic the way people imagine justice looking. There was no shouting match on a courthouse lawn. There was just the slow, grinding machinery of a fraud investigation running its course. Tyler was charged with forgery, attempted theft by deception, and misappropriation of client funds related to his insurance agency. Facing the weight of all 3, and facing a wife who was no longer speaking to him, he took a plea deal in exchange for cooperating fully with investigators, and, in his cooperation statement, in a move that told me everything about the kind of man he'd become underneath that easy smile, he tried to describe Renee as an equal architect of the scheme, hoping to shave time off his own sentence by spreading the blame onto the mother of his child. Renee found out about that statement the same way I did from Harold, on a phone call. I was told later she sat with the news for a long time without saying anything, and that when she finally spoke, what she said was that she understood now, fully, what kind of man she'd built a marriage with, and what kind of choices fear and money can make a person capable of, even when they love someone. She came to my gate on a Sunday evening in November, alone, without calling first. I watched her through the kitchen window, standing on the other side of the cattle gate in a light rain, not buzzing the intercom, not knocking, just standing there with her arms wrapped around herself like she didn't know if she still had the right to walk onto this land. I thought about Carol, near the end, telling me not to let my pride mistake someone's growth for weakness. I thought about Josie's crayon drawing, my house labeled somebody else's, and how a child shouldn't have to carry the confusion the adults around her created. I put on my jacket and walked out into the rain. Renee didn't say much at first. She just cried, the real kind, not the performed kind I'd seen in my kitchen weeks before. She told me she'd filed for divorce. She told me Josie was staying with her and that she'd finally, fully told the investigators everything she knew, holding nothing back to protect Tyler, not anymore. She told me she was ashamed, that she'd let fear and a desperate husband's convincing words turn her against the one parent who'd never once, in her whole life, given her a reason not to trust him. I didn't forgive her that night, not completely, not in the neat way stories sometimes want you to. Trust is not a light switch, but I told her the gate was open, that it had always been open, and that whatever came next between us, we'd have to build it slow, the way Carol and I built everything that ever lasted carefully, honestly, and with our own hands. Tyler was sentenced the following spring to 3.5 years in a federal facility for wire fraud and forgery. Along with restitution, he will likely spend the rest of his working life paying back. The insurance agency was dissolved. The condo was seized as part of asset forfeiture proceedings. My ranch stayed exactly where it had always been, under my name, on my land, built by hands that never once needed anyone to watch them working. Josie comes out most Sundays now. She helps me feed the cattle, and last week she drew a new picture at my kitchen table. No crayons this time, just a pencil, careful and slow. It was our house, the real one, with all three of us standing inside the fence together. She didn't say anything when she handed it to me. She didn't have to. I keep it on the refrigerator now, right where Carol used to keep Renee's drawings 40 years ago. And some mornings I sit at that same kitchen table with my coffee, and I look at it a long while before I start my day, thinking about how a man can spend his whole life building something quiet and solid, never asking anyone to notice, and how sometimes the only way you find out it was strong enough is when somebody tries to tear it down and it simply will not fall.